There are crimes that claw at the edges of what we believe possible. Crimes that don't just shock, they rewrite the rules of horror. But nothing in this world prepares you for the moment a mother becomes a monster. We are raised to believe mothers are sacred. They are the first voice we hear, the first hands that hold us. They are supposed to be safety, warmth, love. But what happens when that love curdles? When the hands that rock the cradle become the ones that bury it? This is the story of Shirley Klinger, a woman who didn't just cross the line. She set it on fire and walked through the flames. This wasn't just murder. It was a message, a punishment, a perverse act of love twisted into the worst kind of hate. And the most terrifying part? Shirley Klinger wasn't some snarling beast. She wasn't a demon. She was a mother, a wife, a woman who, somewhere along the way, decided that if she couldn't have her family, no one could. Violence against children is the deepest wound a society can bear. It carves through the illusion of safety, leaving behind scars that never truly fade. We lock our doors at night, teach our kids about strangers, install cameras in nurseries. But what happens when the danger doesn't come from the shadows? What happens when it wears the face of love itself? Tonight, we pull back the curtain on a horror that redefined evil. A case so chilling, it forces us to question everything we thought we knew about motherhood, about sanity, about the line between human and monster. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's about the warnings we missed, the cries for help we dismissed, and the way darkness can grow in the last places we'd ever think to look. Shirley Renee Klinger wasn't always a name that made people shudder. Once, she was just a little girl with scraped knees and dreams as bright as summer. She played with dolls, tucked them into makeshift cribs, sang them lullabies with all the tenderness of a child mimicking love. Back then, her future stretched out like an open road. College, marriage, a baby of her own to rock to sleep. But dreams, like fruit left too long in the sun, can spoil. No one noticed the exact moment the rot set in. Maybe it began in the quiet hours of night, when Shirley lay awake staring at the ceiling, her thoughts turning over like stones in a river, each one darker than the last. Maybe it was the way her laughter started to sound hollow, like an echo in an empty house. Or maybe it was the day she held her newborn daughter, Betty, for the first time, and instead of joy, she felt nothing. A mother's love is supposed to be instinctive, immediate, a force of nature. But for Shirley, it was a language she couldn't speak, a song she couldn't hear. And as the weeks passed, that emptiness inside her grew teeth. She watched her husband, Daniel, cradle their daughter, his face alight with devotion that should have been hers. She listened to him whisper promises to Betty, promises that used to belong to her. And with every kiss he pressed to their baby's forehead, Shirley felt something inside her crack a little more. The doctors called it postpartum psychosis, a storm in the brain, a sickness. But to Shirley, it didn't feel like an illness. It felt like clarity. The world had taken everything from her. Now, she would take something back. This is the story of how a mother became a myth, a warning, a nightmare seared into the memories of everyone who heard her name. And it all began with a single thought, whispered in the dark. If I can't have my family, no one can. The first cracks in Shirley Klinger's psyche appeared like hairline fractures in fine china, nearly invisible, but weakening the structure with each passing day. At first, it manifested in small ways that could almost be mistaken for ordinary exhaustion. The way her hands would pause just a moment too long before reaching for baby Betty. How her laughter at Daniel's jokes now carried a hollow, tinny quality, like a music box winding down. The nursery, once decorated with such tender anticipation, began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a stage where Shirley played a role she no longer understood. Those early weeks of motherhood should have been filled with sleepy midnight feedings and the sweet, milky scent of a newborn. Instead, Shirley found herself standing over the crib at 3 a.m, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Betty's chest with a curious detachment. The baby's tiny fingers curled instinctively around Shirley's thumb during feedings, but where there should have been an overwhelming rush of maternal bonding, Shirley felt only distance, a glass wall separating her from the emotions she knew she ought to feel. The more Daniel doted on their daughter, the thicker that wall became. You could see it in the photographs from that time. Shirley holding Betty at her christening, her smile technically correct, but her eyes strangely vacant. Daniel beaming with paternal pride, while Shirley's arms seemed to hold the baby at just slightly too stiff an angle. In one particularly telling snapshot, the family posed together on Betty's 2-month birthday. Daniel's face alight with joy as he nuzzled the infant, while Shirley's gaze drifted somewhere just beyond a camera lens, her expression unreadable. These were the warning signs no one thought to examine too closely. After all, every new mother gets tired, doesn't she? The changes accelerated as summer faded into fall. Shirley began keeping meticulous notes about Betty's feeding schedule, not out of devotion, but as if she were conducting some clinical observation. She stopped singing lullabies, instead humming tunelessly, while mechanically going through the motions of childcare. Her once vibrant personality flattened into a disturbing calmness, like the eerie stillness before a storm. When well-meaning neighbors asked how she was coping, Shirley would respond with perfect, rehearsed answers that satisfied their concern, while revealing nothing of the war raging inside her mind. Meanwhile, Daniel remained blissfully unaware, attributing his wife's behavior to normal postpartum adjustment. He'd come home from work to find Shirley staring blankly at the wall, while Betty cried in her swing, only to have Shirley snap to attention the moment she noticed his presence. "She just ate," Shirley would say smoothly, lifting the baby with practiced motions that looked like care to the untrained eye. But alone in the house, the facade sometimes slipped. There were moments when Shirley would watch Betty with an expression that wasn't quite hatred, but something far more unsettling, the way a scientist might regard a specimen. The breaking point came on an unremarkable Tuesday evening. Daniel had come home to find Shirley sitting perfectly still in the rocking chair, Betty fussing in her arms. What chilled him to the bone wasn't anything she did, but what she said when he reached for the baby. "She's stealing your love," Shirley murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel laughed it off at the time, assuming it was just exhaustion talking. But that night, as he drifted to sleep, he would remember how Shirley's fingers had tightened almost imperceptibly around Betty before finally relinquishing her. In the weeks that followed, Shirley's behavior took on an eerie precision. She began waking exactly 15 minutes before Betty's nighttime feedings, standing motionless in the doorway of the nursery until baby's cries began. Her meal preparations became strangely elaborate, with particular attention paid to the sharpening of knives and the preparation of rich sauces. Daniel, preoccupied with work and the joyful chaos of new fatherhood, failed to connect these dots. Even when he came home one evening to find Shirley meticulously scrubbing the kitchen from floor to ceiling at midnight, he chalked it up to nesting instincts resurfacing. The final descent happened quickly, though in hindsight the signs had been there all along. Shirley stopped pretending to sleep when Daniel got up for nighttime feedings, instead watching him with unblinking eyes from her side of the bed. She developed a habit of standing just a little too close when he held Betty, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she observed their interactions. Then came the day Daniel returned from work to find the house spotless, dinner simmering on the stove, and Shirley waiting for him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I made your favorite," she said, gesturing to the table set with their wedding china. It should have been a sweet gesture. Instead, the air hummed with something unspoken, something terrible. That evening, as Daniel took his first bite of the strangely rich stew, Shirley watched him with an intensity that bordered on rapture. The way his teeth closed around the tender meat, the way his throat worked as he swallowed. She leaned forward slightly when he went for a second bite, her lips parting as if to speak, then thinking better of it. The ordinary domestic scene, the clink of silverware, the soft jazz playing in the background, the candlelight flickering across their faces, made what came next all the more horrifying. Because the greatest terrors don't announce themselves with thunder and lightning. They come disguised as normalcy, as routine, as a quiet Tuesday dinner between husband and wife. And by the time you realize something is wrong, it's already far, far too late. The air hung thick with the aroma of slow-cooked meat and herbs, the kind of smell that normally would have made Daniel's mouth water. The candles flickered between them, casting dancing shadows across Shirley's face as she watched him take that first bite. He chewed slowly, savoring the rich, gamey flavor. Something different from her usual cooking, deeper, more complex. "This is incredible," he murmured, already reaching for another forkful, not noticing how Shirley's fingers tightened around her wine glass, her knuckles bleaching white. The second bite brought an odd texture, something small and hard that shouldn't have been there. Daniel's teeth closed around it instinctively before his brain could protest. That sound, that terrible, tiny crunch, froze in mid-chew. His tongue worked automatically, pushing the foreign object forward until it rested against his lip. When he removed it with trembling fingers, the world seemed to tilt violently sideways. There, glistening on his fingertip, was a sliver of something unmistakably human. A tiny, pearlescent fingernail, still soft at the edges like a newborn's. Daniel's breath came in short, panic bursts as his eyes darted to the high chair in the corner, empty. To the baby monitor, silent. To Shirley's face, smiling. That smile, not triumphant, not crazed, but serene, peaceful. The smile of a woman who had finally solved an impossible puzzle. "Where's Betty?" The words tore from his throat raw and ragged. Shirley simply tilted her head, the candlelight catching in her unblinking eyes as she reached across to refill his wine glass with steady hands. The realization hit Daniel like a physical blow, his body reacting before his mind could fully process the horror. He recoiled violently, chair screeching against the floor as he clutched his stomach. The food he'd just swallowed seemed to ride inside him, a living thing trying to claw its way back up. When the first wave of vomit came, it splattered across the pristine tablecloth like abstract art, wine mixing with bile and half-digested meat. Shirley didn't flinch. She just watched, that same small smile playing about her lips as her husband collapsed to his knees, retching uncontrollably. "You always said we were one flesh, Danny." Her voice was soft, almost musical, the way she used a sound when singing lullabies, but the words landed like hammer blows. Daniel's entire body convulsed, his fingers digging into his abdomen as if he could somehow purge the unspeakable truth. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with sweat and spit as he gasped for air between wrenching sobs. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked steadily onward, marking the passage of normal time at a moment that had shattered all normality. When the police arrived hours later, they would find the stock pot still warm on the stove, a tiny sock floating in congealing broth like some grotesque tea bag. They would photograph the dining table with its elegant place settings now in disarray, the half-eaten meal congealing on fine china. But what haunted them most wasn't the physical evidence. It was a look on Shirley's face as they led her away. Not remorse, not rage, just quiet satisfaction, as if some cosmic balance had been restored. And Daniel would never be able to explain the sound that escaped him when the detective gently asked where they might find the rest of the remains. A sound not quite human, torn from some primal place beyond language or reason. The sound of a man who had just learned that hell isn't a place we go. It's something we carry inside us forever. The steel door clanged shut behind Shirley Klinger with finality that echoed through the prison corridor, but the sound was nothing compared to the silence that had settled over her life. The courtroom drama had ended. The media circus had moved on, but the aftermath stretched before her like an endless, gray road. Prison uniforms replaced her floral dresses. The clinking of handcuffs became her new jewelry, and the fluorescent lights of the visiting room cast harsh shadows where candlelight once danced. Yet in her eyes, you could still see it, that eerie calm, as if she'd accomplished something profound rather than committed the most unnatural act imaginable. Meanwhile, Daniel wandered through what remained of their home, like a ghost haunting his own life. The nursery door remained shut, a shrine to what might have been gathering dust behind it. He couldn't bring himself to remove the tiny socks still folded in the dresser, the half-empty bottle of baby shampoo in the bath, the mobile that would never spin above Betty's crib again. Every mirror in the house reflected a stranger, a man aged decades and months, with hollow cheeks and eyes that had forgotten how to cry. The worst moments came unexpectedly, catching the scent of rosemary in the supermarket and doubling over in nausea, hearing a child's laughter in the park and breaking into a cold sweat, waking from nightmares where his teeth crunched down on something small and fragile. The trial had been a spectacle, of course. Reporters jostled for seats as psychiatric experts debated whether Shirley was a monster or a victim herself. The prosecution painted her as cold, calculating, pointing to the meticulous way she prepared that last meal. The defense spoke of hormonal tsunamis and broken brain chemistry, how postpartum psychosis could turn love inside out like a cheap glove. The jury saw photos of Betty's tiny fingernail in the stew, heard the 911 call, where Daniel's voice cracked like dry wood, listened to neighbors describe Shirley's strange behavior in those final weeks. In the end, life without parole, a sentence that felt both too harsh and too lenient all at once. Dr. Shaw, the psychiatrist who evaluated Shirley, would spend years haunted by her case. We failed her long before she failed her child, he'd tell colleagues over whiskey in dimly lit bars. He'd recount the warning signs they now saw so clearly in hindsight, how Shirley had stopped making eye contact during pediatrician visits, how she'd begun referring to Betty as it in therapy sessions, the way she'd obsessively cleaned the same spot on the kitchen floor for hours. All the red flags waving frantically while everyone looked the other way. Postpartum psychosis affects nearly 20% of new mothers to some degree, yet most medical professionals receive barely any training to recognize it. The system, Dr. Shaw realized too late, was designed to notice only the most obvious cracks, while Shirley had been crumbling from the inside out. As seasons changed and years passed, the story took on a life of its own. True crime podcasts dissected it with clinical fascination. Online forums buzzed with amateur psychologists diagnosing Shirley from afar. The house where it happened became a macabre tourist stop before being demolished. But for those who lived it, the wounds never truly healed. Daniel moved across the country, but couldn't outrun the memories. Shirley's parents changed their name and disappeared into quiet shame. Even the detectives who worked the case found themselves waking at 3 a.m., haunted by the image of that tiny sock in the stock pot. Perhaps the greatest tragedy wasn't the horror itself, but how preventable it might have been. With proper screening, with real mental health support for new mothers, with a society that looks beyond the Instagram-perfect facade of motherhood, maybe Betty would have celebrated her 5th birthday. Maybe Shirley would have gotten help instead of a life sentence. Maybe Daniel wouldn't spend every anniversary in a rehab facility. The signs were all there, bright as warning lights on a dark road. But no one thought to look until it was far, far too late. The nursery remains frozen in time, a perfect monument to everything that was lost. Dust motes dance in the sunlight filtering through the half-drawn curtains, catching on the mobile that will never spin for tiny grasping fingers again. The crib sheets, still crisp with that new baby smell, will never know the warmth of a sleeping child. In the closet, miniature dresses hang untouched, the price tag swaying gently when the door opens, like ghosts whispering of birthdays that will never come, first days of school that will never be. A stuffed rabbit sits propped in the corner, its black button eyes staring eternally at the empty rocker where a mother should have sung lullabies. Outside, the world moves on as it always does. Seasons change. Flowers bloom and die. Children grow taller while their parents grow older. But in this room, time stands still. The diapers in the drawer will never be used. The baby book with its empty pages will never be filled. The tiny shoes by the door will never know the scuff marks of first steps. Every object tells the same heartbreaking story, of preparations made in love, for a life that ended before it truly began. Yet in this tragedy lies a terrible lesson we cannot afford to ignore. Betty Klinger's short life and horrific death hold up a mirror to our collective failure. How many times do we see a struggling mother and look away? How often do we dismiss a woman's cries for help as exhaustion or hormones? How many warning signs do we miss because we're too busy, too uncomfortable, too convinced that such darkness only exists in headlines and horror movies? The truth is far more disturbing. Monsters don't always announce themselves with growls and gnashing teeth. Sometimes they were the face of your neighbor, your sister, your friend. Sometimes they smile politely in the grocery store, while their minds fracture behind their eyes. Sometimes they bake cookies for the PTA meeting, while fantasizing about unthinkable acts. And always, always, there are signs we choose not to see until it's too late. This isn't just Shirley Klinger's story. It's ours. It's about the systems that fail women every day, the support that never comes, the help that arrives a moment too late. For every Shirley behind bars, there are 100 more slipping through the cracks, their pain unnoticed until it explodes in violence. We lock up the monsters after the fact, but who helps them before they become monstrous? Who reaches out when the first dark thoughts appear? Who notices when a new mother's laughter sounds just a little too hollow, when her eyes go just a bit too blank? Betty never got to take her first steps, say her first word, lose her first tooth. But her death could be the step that changes everything, the word that wakes us up, the loss that finally makes us see. The candlelight vigils end. The news cycles move on. But the work remains to look closer, to listen harder, to speak up when something feels wrong. Not just for the children who need protecting, but for the mothers who need saving from themselves. Because the scariest monsters aren't the ones under the bed. They're the ones we create when we look away. The story of Shirley Klinger doesn't end when the screen fades to black. It lingers in the back of your mind like a shadow you can't shake, a question that demands to be answered. What do we do with this horror now that we've seen it? How do we move forward after peering into such darkness? The answer is simpler than you might think. We share it. We talk about it. We force others to look at what we'd rather turn away from. This isn't just entertainment. It's a wake-up call. If Shirley's descent into madness unsettled you, if Daniel's unimaginable pain moved you, if Sweet Betty's stolen future angered you, then don't let the story end here. Share it with someone who needs to understand how fragile the mind can be. Send it to that new mother in your life who seems just a little too quiet lately. Post it where policymakers might see it, and finally fund proper mental health care for struggling parents. The conversation doesn't stop when you click away. Down in the comments, voices are already rising, some sharing their own brushes with postpartum darkness, others recalling warning signs they missed in loved ones, a few just now realizing they might need help themselves. Your story could be the one that saved a life. Your words could be the light that keeps someone from slipping into their own personal abyss. And if you want to keep fighting the darkness, subscribe. Because next time, we're shining a light on the heroes working tirelessly to pull children from harm's way, the foster parents who open their homes, the social workers who work impossible hours, the ordinary people doing extraordinary things to protect the vulnerable. The world is full of monsters, yes, but it's also full of warriors. Be part of that fight. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. And most importantly, don't look away. The next story needs to be heard just as badly as this one. Because the moment we stop listening is the moment we let the darkness win.